You're listening to the Plugged In podcast presented by the Institute for Energy Research. To find out more about our work, visit our website at instituteforenergyresearch.org. Welcome to the Plugged In podcast. I'm your host, Alex Stevens.
And I'm Jordan McGillis.
Joining us today to discuss the Transportation Climate Initiative is David T. Stevenson. David is the director of the Center for Energy Competitiveness at the Caesar Rodney Institute, a Delaware-based think tank that promotes a framework of individual liberty, property rights, free markets, and limited government. Stevenson has become one of the most respected voices on energy and the environment in the state policy network. He served on President Trump's EPA transition team following the 2016 election, and he's the author of the 2018 paper titled A Review of the Regional Gas Initiative, which was published in the Cato Journal. David, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
I'm happy to be here. Please don't stumble over Caesar Rodney's name. He got out of his sickbed, rode his horse 40 miles to Philadelphia to sign the Constitution to make Delaware the first state. That's why we're named after him.
Thanks for joining us.
Hear you.
Discussing the Transportation Climate Initiative. Just to start, if you had 90 seconds to explain what TCI is, just give a quick overview of what we're here to discuss today.
Yes. TCI stands for the Transportation Climate Initiative. It's being considered by 12 states and D.C. to join. It is basically, at its most basic, a gasoline tax. And that tax is going to be raised until everybody in those states decides to buy a $20,000 premium cost electric vehicle that uses a 1,000-pound cell phone battery. The revenues will not be used for highway construction or repair like a normal gas tax. It's going to be used to give subsidies, tax credits to rich folks who can afford to buy the $20,000 extra vehicle. And then they get an extra bonus because they get an exemption to commute to work by themselves in high occupancy vehicle lanes. So it's really they're paying a permit fee to use the HOV lanes, and maybe they'll save a little bit of carbon dioxide on the side.
And where would TCI go into effect? This is a regional proposal. What's the region we're talking about?
Right now, the states that are considering it are Virginia all the way up the coast to Maine. So you've got most of the middle Atlantic states, and it's mostly the states that were involved in the regional greenhouse gas initiative, which was a carbon dioxide tax on emissions from electric generators. That program is a decade old. It didn't work. It didn't actually reduce emissions, which is what I determined in the paper I did. And now they want to do the same thing for gasoline. It's not going to work there either.
In terms of the implementation, well, first in terms of the adoption of TCI, and likewise, you could probably talk about Reggie here. How is it actually adopted as law? Is this through state legislatures? Are these decisions made by governors? How does a state sign on legally to this agreement?
A little background. The program was conceived by the Georgetown Climate Center. It's a private nonprofit. Its biggest vocal supporter is Governor Baker in Massachusetts. Its primary funder is the Barr Foundation out of Boston. So about 3 years ago, they started talking about doing this plan to get everybody into electric vehicles. And they got state governors sent 2 representatives from each state, usually somebody from the environmental department. And they were down talking about how we were going to do this. And then finally, this past December, they actually came out with some details of how they thought this was going to work and what it was going to cost and what the benefits would be. So they have a memorandum of understanding. They are accepting public comment till the end of February, and they are expecting basically the state governor to say we're going to proceed with this by April. They would sign the memorandum of understanding. The next step, there will be a model rule created. That model rule will be the basis for either legislation or an administrative procedure. That won't come out till December. At that point, the states will either pass it by the legislature or do it administratively. There's been a lot of pushback on carbon dioxide taxes in states that you would think would accept it. For example, Washington, Oregon, Vermont all failed to pass taxes like this. Provinces in Canada that had accepted it, their governments were overturned. And Australia, the national government was overturned. And in France, it led to the Yellow Vest movement. So along the way, the Georgetown Climate Center was pushing that this would not go to legislatures because it wouldn't pass, and that they would do it by an administrative procedure. What has happened in the last months with the opposition is that they're the only state now that seems to be on a track to do it administratively and not take it to the legislature is Massachusetts. Everybody else, we've had commitments that they're either not going to participate or going to participate through the legislative process, which is the right way to do this. The way the program will work, the way the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative worked, electric generators had to buy allowances to emit carbon dioxide as they generated electricity in the participating states. The allowances were bought in an auction and then had to be turned in at the end of each year, depending on how much emissions there were. There was a period of time when there were so many extra allowances because things were happening. The natural gas revolution reduced coal-fired power plants. Emissions went down dramatically, and the states that were participating were unhappy with the revenue they were getting. They wanted more money. So they created mechanisms. They had a target price, and if the price went over the target price, they were going to put extra allowances into the auction. And if there were not enough, they would take allowances away. So what they basically did was sent a price signal, and that's the price that is being paid now for Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative allowances. They're going to do the same exact process, except instead of electric generators, it'll have to be the companies that own the gasoline tankers that take gasoline from a distribution center to local gas stations. Where the electric generators had a lot of capital, they had the ability to maneuver. A lot of them switched from coal, high emissions coal, to lower emissions natural gas. These tanker truck owners, they have no method of reducing emissions. It's a matter of how many people are buying gasoline and how much they're driving. So it's going to be very difficult for the people that are being directly taxed to do anything about it. The tax actually will get passed along at the gas pump. So you've got governors in Virginia, in Maine, in Rhode Island saying, we're not going to do this if it passes on to the people at the gas tank. And then you've got other states that have decided, well, we want to pass regular gas taxes this year because we need highway construction or repair. And then you've got states like Governor Sununu has said, forget it. We're not going to participate. We're not going to raise taxes on our folks. We expect Governor Scott in Vermont to do something similar. So this seems to be falling apart. And it's a good thing it is falling apart, because the people that are going to be hurt worse by this are the poor. This is the group here at the Georgetown Climate Center likes to talk about environmental justice and how they're going to buy electric buses and they're going to extend sidewalks to make it easier to walk. That's their version. It's this gas tax. If anybody that has a car is going to pay about $200 more a year for their gasoline, and they're the ones that are going to be hurt. The bottom 20% of the population in the United States is only making about $14,000 a year, and they are in what's called energy poverty. Energy poverty is when you're paying more than 10% of your monthly income for energy. So you want to keep your house warm, you want to be able to cook, you want to be able to drive your car. Every second month, 20% of the folks in the country have to make a decision to pay the utility bill or buy food or medicine. This is hurting them very badly. If you want environmental justice, look at the shale gas revolution. Natural gas, by being so inexpensive has not only reduced carbon dioxide emissions, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but it saved every American family about $2,000 a year. That's environmental justice. The United States has
What
reduced.
I see,
Go ahead, George.
what I see here is another battle in this growing struggle in our country between urban, dense interests, often concentrated on the coast, and people who live in more outlying areas, exurbs, and rural areas that utilize the automobile as their primary means of transportation. There's so much pressure these days on people to reorient their lifestyles in order to accommodate the demands of the climate movement.
You're exactly right. This is very much an urban rural divide. It is being pushed by people in the cities who a lot of them don't even own cars. They're using public transportation because you can't drive a car around Boston or New York very easily. They're not going to be hurt by this tax at all. And then if you've got people in the suburbs who are also making higher incomes, and as I mentioned before, they get to buy the electric vehicle and commute more easily by getting a free ticket into the HOV lanes. So you've got people in those two areas that are making decent salaries. They won't be affected by this, but it's really going to hurt the rural poor. I was testifying last week at the Pennsylvania Senate. They were considering the TCI, and Pennsylvania is mostly rural. Those folks outside of the major cities are driving long distances. They're getting paid less, and they're the ones that are going to be hurt the worst by this. When we talk about somebody paying $200 more a year, that depends on how many miles you drive. They're the ones driving the miles, and they're driving the older vehicles, and a lot of them are driving trucks because of the industries they work in. So they're going to be paying a lot more than $200 a year for this. And the senators, most of the senators got that. That there were a few from the big cities who think that global warming is this really serious crisis. My suggestion to them is, if you think it's such a serious crisis, why do you want to pursue a policy that doesn't work? You're just doing something to make yourselves look good and feel good, but Reggie and the TCI, by actual practice for 10 years on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, doesn't work. Why would you want to put money into a project that doesn't work if you really think this is serious?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at TCI in terms of the other policies, in terms of energy in the Northeast. We discussed this a little bit before we started recording, but when you look at the limitations of new pipeline infrastructure, the Jones Act, any number of things that are raising energy costs in the Northeast, this would just be another thing on top of that, like you've said, is going to hurt predominantly people in rural areas, the poor. Just talk a little bit about just the overall desire for people to want to raise costs on energy in the Northeast and what this looks like in terms of that.
Yeah, you've got, as you said, you've got limited natural gas resources, so you're paying more for natural gas. You've got the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. You've got a heavy burden of buying expensive wind and solar power. The renewable portfolio standard mandates are higher. You've got historic reasons why the Northeast and New England are higher electricity cost states. So what we see, you can never say that it's only Reggie or it's only the TCI or it's only the lack of natural gas, but you've got a pattern of policies that have made energy so expensive that energy-intensive industries have left these northeastern states, where the nation goods production grew 20%. In the Reggie states, it dropped 7% over a decade. And when you lose jobs, I mean, the kind of jobs you're losing, I'll give you some examples in Delaware. We lost a steel mill. It went to Oregon and Saskatchewan. We lost 2 car manufacturers. They went to Texas and Tennessee. We lost a bleach manufacturing plant that uses an electrolysis process. That went to Louisiana. Those were 7. We lost many other plants as well, chemical plants. And those are the ones that are paying $75,000 a year to blue-collar workers. And those jobs disappeared. In Delaware, our median household income dropped $9,500 a year between 2000 and 2017 because of all these lost jobs. And the same thing's happening around the country. I was in Maine a couple of weeks ago. They're having the same problem. Median household incomes are dropping. Cost of living is going up. People are hurting. And these programs, not only do they hurt, but they are not succeeding. Delaware with its 20% requirement, Maryland with its 20% requirement for wind and solar, Maine and Massachusetts, they're only producing an average of 4% in state of the wind and solar they're demanding. In Massachusetts, it's almost all coming from Maine. In Maryland and Delaware, it's coming from wind farms in Pennsylvania. So these states have these great plans, but they don't want to touch their states. Massachusetts wants to bring hydropower from Quebec. They want to bring it on transmission lines that'll tear up Maine's forest. Meanwhile, they're importing half of their electricity. Ask them to dam a river. Ask them to build a power plant. They don't want to touch it, but they're very happy if, and windmill, they won't even build windmills in Massachusetts. They're happy if they get built in somebody else's backyard. So I've just had it with all this. They can all go down a tube and power go out as far as I'm concerned, because that's eventually what's going to happen. They're just going to not have electricity.
Something that we talk about a lot at IER is the impracticability of these policies, and that there are so many aspects of electricity generation, of transmission, of transporting motor fuels that are impossible for central planners to take into account. And so these schemes never end up working out the way that they are intended to. But one thing that we should stress here, so as not to mislead our reader or our listeners, is that TCI would not only impact people in the rural areas. They're going to be hit hard, but everyone uses motor fuels, even if they're not themselves driving, because most of the products that we get are at some point transported by truck. So even if I live on the Upper East Side in New York City, the food that I eat each day is getting delivered into town by an 18-wheeler, and that needs motor fuel.
Exactly. Just the normal loss, when you charge more for anything like gasoline or electricity, it means you have less money to spend on other things. So there are indirect costs, and typically for energy products, you can add 50% to the impact, negative impact, when you raise those prices in the rest of the economy. You get other people that are hurt, and as you said, on top of that, you're getting induced changes because everything you buy is more expensive. So it's just none of this works. And the basic goal here, they realize, the people that are purporting this thing realize that these vehicles are so ruthlessly expensive. You're talking about a compact vehicle, first of all, that you could buy a Honda Fit for $18,000, or you can buy the same vehicle from Chevrolet, the Chevrolet Bolt, for $38,000. It's just insane how expensive they are. But so they say, well, we need credits, tax credits. Well, the federal tax credit dropped $3,000 last year for Teslas. Guess what Tesla did? They lowered the price $3,000. They do not need these subsidies. They're just fattening their bottom line by charging more than they would have otherwise. If you really want to move it, let the free market work. Let these vehicles compete on an even playing field, and the prices will come down. So there's just so many negatives to this that it's really frustrating that anybody is even taking this seriously.
I know you've been traveling past couple months. You've said for, just to educate the public, and I think you've testified a few times in front of state legislatures. What's the response been from the public, and then I guess from policymakers that you've spoken to as well?
It looks to me like the gas, not to make a pun, actually to make a pun, uh, is running out on this thing. You've got New Hampshire already pulling out, Vermont probably pulling out, Maine, Virginia, and others saying Connecticut, we need to have a regular gas tax because our roads are falling apart. They're not going to pass both. Uh, you've got it down now that, except for Massachusetts, every state that had considered doing this administratively is saying we're going to do it through the legislature, which kicks it down the road because most of the legislators are not going to approve this. People are going to be in an uproar over a 30-cent gas tax. When Delaware tried to pass a 10-cent a gallon gas tax a couple of years ago, there was such an uproar it never got into the Energy Committee, let alone get a vote. So what appears to be, and the best news of all is I think Governor Baker in Massachusetts is seeing the writing on the wall here because he started talking about his backup plan, which is to join with California and Quebec, which have similar taxes. The only thing maybe he hasn't thought about is the U.S. Attorney General has sued California over this very compact because it was basically a state entering into a foreign treaty, which is not permitted in the U.S. Constitution. So there's a lawsuit going forward. So I think in the end, I think Governor Baker and maybe Governor Cuomo will join this, but I think the rest of the states will take a pass. And that's the smart and right thing to do.
Dave, can you talk about Reggie a bit more and how neighboring states that aren't part of Reggie have adjusted their policies or whether they've reaped any benefit because of the inhospitable regulatory environment across the border?
No, it's actually well, they've gained some business. Certainly, the businesses that left have gone to mostly other states. They have not left the country. They've just gone to other states. So that certainly has been a benefit. But there's a negative. The way prices are established, particularly in the mid-Atlantic states, is there's a bidding process a day ahead and an hour ahead and 5 minutes ahead. And if a higher cost producer bids a high price to meet the need for that particular hour, everybody in a 13-state region or all the generators get the same price. So Reggie itself has charts that showed the Reggie cost, the price of the allowances that gets passed on in the electric prices, actually raises electric prices in other states. And it has cost so far about $2 billion in other states. But Reggie is working to change their target price, quadruple it. We're looking at a potential of non-Reggie states paying as much as $16 billion over the next decade because of Reggie prices. That, by the way, violates the Dormant Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and I would not be surprised to see at some point a lawsuit against the Reggie states passing something that hurts other states down the line. There has been a survey done in Virginia, kind of had an interesting result. You know, a lot of people are saying they want to see efforts to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And the first part of the survey by the Thomas Jefferson Institute explained what the potential benefits were and what TCI was. And 61% of the people said they would support such a program. Then they asked the second part of the question was, here's what it's going to cost. Support went down to 34%. It happens, and that's probably high. I follow, there are voluntary programs where you can buy 100% renewable power. There's also been a lot of surveys, one of the best ones from the University of Michigan, that asked people, if you could buy 100% renewable electricity, how much would you pay extra a month? And 2/3 say, oh, I'd pay $10 extra a month to buy to buy 100% renewable power. Well, around the country, there are hundreds of programs where you can buy renewables voluntarily for about $10 a month. Only about 3% of people ever sign up for one. So even that 34% number, when it actually comes to paying the money at the gas tank, they're not going to be happy. You're talking maybe 3% support by the time you get real human actions.
That's very fascinating when you draw those distinctions between people's expression of preferences and then what's actually demonstrated in practice. And one thing that Alex and I have kicked around kind of as a little bit of a thought experiment is if airlines were actually to offer their customers a little extra fee to offset their emissions from those flights. A lot of people are saying airlines should be doing this. And my thought is I'd love to see them do that so that we could have that data and see how many people actually are willing to make that simple selection of, oh, I'll pay $75 more for this flight than I otherwise would need to, or whatever it may be. And it'd be interesting to see how people actually follow through with what they say they'd like to do.
Yes, that would be interesting. Not very many people would pay the money, obviously. The actual reaction of people towards these voluntary electric programs, it's covered on the National Renewable Energy Laboratory alternative fuel website, or alternative electric website. And you can download the actual participation rates. If you're crazy and live in Oregon, about 9% of the population agrees to it. But in most places, it's way under 3%. There are states where it's offered and there's only 0.2 or 0.3% of the population signs up. So it depends partly on who you're talking to. But it's the real life example, and there are half a dozen studies like the study at the University of Michigan that asked these questions on voluntary participation. And it's a very different thing that people say versus what they actually do.
Is there anything that we haven't covered on TCI here that you think is important for our listeners to know?
One of the things that you hope to accomplish with higher gasoline prices is that people will drive less miles. U.S. Energy Information Agency has done an excellent study on that, and they determined that to get 1 less percent driving, you need to increase the price of gasoline by 25 to 50%. It's very inelastic. People will drive no matter what the price is. You've got $4.50 to $5 a gallon in California, and people are still driving. Right now, I'm paying $2.13 in Delaware. There's not a lot of change in driving behavior because of the higher price, and I don't think there's going to be a big move to paying $20,000 extra for a car to move to electric vehicles. And one of the key things to remember about that is these are basically cell phone batteries. You put a bunch of cell phone batteries together and you create a big battery for a car. And as you know, these things wear out. But they also, how many cell phone batteries are used around the world? It's a huge volume being manufactured. We've seen the cost of cell phone batteries come down probably 80% because of economies of scale. But if you look now, that advantage is pretty much disappearing. The price of batteries has stopped falling. And that means the price of car batteries is not going to fall much in the next decade. And that's one of the things that folks like the TCI folks imagine happening. They think prices are going to drop in half. U.S. Energy Information Agency is saying over the next decade the price might drop 5 or 10%, which I think is realistic. So these are not going to get cheaper faster. And this whole program is just not going to work.
Where can people learn more about the Caesar Rodney Institute and your work in Delaware there?
Yes, we're at the CaesarRodney.org is our website. That's CAESAR, Rodney, RODNEY. A lot of this is published on the websites, and I'd always be happy to take an email and answer anybody that's got anything to say. It's David Stevenson at CaesarRodney.org.
Great. Our guest today has been David T. Stevenson from Caesar Rodney Institute. David, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for giving me the chance. This is a topic people need to know about.
Absolutely.